one thing that most people, even those who study, most people think that the language that the Hebrews were speaking was Aramaic. And I have heard this from a lot of people. So much so that, as you know, when, if I'm not mistaken, Mel Gibson made the movie Passion of the Christ, if I'm not mistaken his name. But anyways, in that movie, The Passion of the Christ, they made it in Aramaic because they claimed that that was the language that the Messiah spoke when he was on earth. However, in scriptures, we find that when the Messiah appeared to Shaul, who became Paulus or Paul, the Messiah spoke in Hebrew to him. So we have that testimony from Paul. Then, when Messiah was hung on the tree, when he was crucified, when he was sacrificed, the um, the title that he had above his head said Yahushúa of Nazareth, King of the Yahudim, basically. Or basically it said Yahushua from Nazareth and King of the Yahudim. Like I have said, those words in Hebrew are four words, and if we were to connect the beginning of each of those words, basically if we were to take the first letter from each of those words, we would get the name Yahweh. So that title that the Messiah had written in Hebrew when he was sacrificed said Yahweh as an acronym. But as we know also, Pilate, when he wrote that, he wrote it in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Those were the three languages in which he wrote that title above the head of the Messiah when he was sacrificed. That is to show that the three main languages of that area, Israel, were Hebrew, which was the language of the Yahudim, the Hebrews, the Israelim, then Greek, which was the language of the previous empire, and therefore their language was still known and used, and then Latin, which was the language of Rome, the empire at that time, which ended up killing Messiah. So in scriptures, I just mentioned two examples, but there are more actually, that show that the Messiah spoke Hebrew. When he was on earth, Hebrew was still a language that was being spoken. Anyways, Aramaic is very close to Hebrew. It uses the same letters, and the pronunciations are very similar in many cases. So perhaps that is why, next to the spiritual reason, that is why many people claim that Aramaic was the language that was being spoken when Messiah was on earth. However, the spiritual reason would be, of course, that that would cause confusion. Remember that the word confusion comes from, or is the meaning of the word Babel, as in the place where the Tower of Babel was built by Nimrod. And when he was building that tower to rebel against the Most High came down and he divided the language that they had at the moment, which was Hebrew, unlike what most people, well, some people believe. The language was divided in 70, and that's when the nations started to separate and all of that. But my point is that since that was the time in which the language became 70, that was the reason why the name Babel was given to that land, which means confusion, because their languages were confused, and the people got confused because they could not understand each other, and they started to make mistakes in building the tower and a bunch of other things. So confusion comes from the place and the moment in history in which languages were divided. So obviously the enemy, who is the author of confusion, and that would be a teaching for another time why all that is connected.